Here and welcome to the channel. Today it's all about small block Chevy bolt-on performance. In this video we're going to take a look at how the small block Chevy responds to typical bolt-on performance. We're talking about cylinder heads, camshafts, and intake manifolds on 3 different combinations: a 305, a 327, and a 350. So how do they respond? Let's find out. We're going to start off with our trio of mild performance small blocks with actually a 305. I know that I'm going to get a lot of comments about the 305. That's the worst motor that Chevy ever made. But this one actually started out as a comparison I did between the 5-liter 305 and the 5-liter 302 from the 80s and early 90s on the Ford side. And it's interesting that a lot of the guys would take, the 302 makes a lot more power because even though they're both 5 liters and one is 3 cubic inches less than the other, everybody likes the Ford better because it has a 4-inch bore. So the much maligned 305 Chevy, everyone says, that's a terrible motor, just get a 350. But the 305 Chevy actually works pretty well and can be made to have a lot of power. The one thing I can say about the Ford-Chevy combination, or about the rivalry, obviously Camaro, Mustang, it goes way back. But in the case of the 302 versus the 305, ultimately I think that the 302 Chevy or Ford has a little bit of an edge, only because it has more cylinder heads to choose from. The small bore 305 is kind of limited, although in this case we were nowhere near using up all of the flow that was available from the trick flow 175 heads that we use on the 305. That being said, on the 302 Ford, there are 20 or 30 or 40 different cylinder heads that you could use on the 302 Ford, and because it has a 4-inch bore, there's lots of heads, and the heads have even more airflow and even more power potential than the limited heads that are available for the 305. But that doesn't stop me from liking this motor, and there's lots of them out there. And back in the day when they were in the Camaros, these Z28s and IROCs and stuff, they actually ran fairly well. And this was actually started out as a low mileage or no mileage 2.5 liter 305. So when it was stock, it produced 267 horsepower and 333 foot-pounds of torque. This thing was run with long tube headers and open exhaust, a Mazir electric water pump, and no accessories. We ran it cold. We ran it with a Holley HP management system. It did have the stock throttle body and stock tune port and stock heads and all of that. But this was actually a very low mileage motor that we got from the guys, or the guy from Westech got from the Chevy race shop. So this thing might have had no miles on it. It actually might have been a time capsule one that came off of the assembly line and then was put in the Chevy race shop, and they ended up doing nothing with it probably, and then the guys from Westech got it, and then I got my hands on it and took it all apart and ruined probably what was a perfectly good tune-port 305. But what we did was, in our comparison between the 305 and the 302 Ford, we equipped them both with basically heads, cam, and intake manifold. So in this case, we replaced the factory heads with the trick flow heads. So they were the TrickFlow Super 23 175 heads, 56cc chambers, 175cc intakes, and 67cc exhaust. They had a 194 and 150 valve package, so they would fit nicely in the small bore of the 305. We put a Comp Extreme Energy 276 hydraulic roller cam in it. This came as a factory hydraulic roller. It was a 224-230 at 50 and 110 and a 502-510 lift split. We also we replaced the tune port injection system with a simple carbureted induction system like this, like you put on most small blocks. It had an RPM, an Edelbrock RPM air gap intake manifold, a dual plane, and a 650 Holley XP. Again, it already had headers and an MSD distributor. So equipped with the dual plane, peak power jumped up to 363 horsepower. And peak torque was at 353 foot-pounds. Now, we did another test on this, and I don't think it's quite as good a combination, but since we're always doing the single plane versus the dual plane stuff, we ran that comparison on this 305. And indeed, the single plane did make more power, made 376 horsepower. And the peak torque checked in at 347 foot-pounds, but happened at a much higher engine speed than the dual plane. And as you can see, from about 5,300 RPM on down, the single plane made less power than the dual plane on the 305. So now that we've taken a look at a 5-liter 305, let's jump up to a 327. This second small block might not be as popular or prevalent as the 5-liter 305 or the other 350 that's kind of the go-to displacement for small block Chevys. But the 327 was very popular. It liked to rev and made good power. This particular example started out as a very impressive one. It was a 365 horse 327 reproduction motor that I did back in the day. And this thing was equipped with 11-to-1 compression, Fuelie heads, the good Duntov camshaft, a dual plane intake. It originally came with a 780 Holley, but we put a 750 on it, and it had long tube headers. And equipped in this manner, it was already starting off making fairly good power, 355 horsepower, and we ran this thing all the way out to 8,000 RPM, and 366 foot-pounds of torque. And the important thing is, you'll notice that it made more torque than horsepower, and that tells us, gives an indication that this thing is being held back by something. In this case, it's probably the cylinder heads. The camshaft can make a bit more power. It has a lot of duration. It has a good intake manifold and carburetor on it. The Fuelie heads could make a little more power than this, but what we did was basically change almost everything. So what we did was add a new camshaft to this combination. It was a Comp Extreme Energy, still a solid flat tapping cam. It was an XS274S, which was a 501, 510 lift, so much more lift than the Duntov cam. It was a 236, 242 degree duration split, even though that was less duration than the Duntov cam, and 110 degree lobe separation angle. We also replaced the Fuelie heads with a set of Airflow Research L98 heads, and then the aluminum heads, obviously aluminum over iron, but also flowed way more than the, as much as 70 or 80 CFM more than the best Fuelie heads. We ran an aftermarket intake manifold, although we could have also run the factory one. But we ran a Speedmaster dual plane high-rise intake manifold and a 750 Holley, just like with the last one. And here's what happened when we ran the dual plane. Power was up dramatically, 441 horsepower and 407 foot-pounds of torque. So now you'll notice that we're making much more horsepower than torque, which gives us an idea that, hey, now the combination is actually working fairly well. But just like with the 305, we also ran a single plane intake on this. And given the fact that we were running the 7,000 RPM, we thought that the single plane might eke out the dual plane and make more power for a fairly good portion of the RPM range. And that's exactly what happened. With the single plane, it made 461 horsepower. Peak torque checked in at 412 foot-pounds. So actually just eked out the dual plane for peak torque. But as you can see, from about 5,000 RPM down, the dual plane made more torque, made more power. But from 5,000 RPM up, the single plane made more power. So again, you always have to choose which one you want. Do you want more power below that point or more power above that point? Honestly, if I was going to have a 7,000 RPM 327, I probably would have the single plane on this. Now we can take a look at a 350. The final of our trio of mild performance small block combinations was a 350, and despite being the largest displacement, it actually made the least amount of horsepower of the three, including the smaller 5-liter combination. And the reason is that it was saddled with a 2-barrel induction system. We did run long tube headers on it, but it basically was stock. It had a good short block. It actually had forged flat top pistons. The reason that we chose that is because we were eventually going to do a lot of modifications. In fact, of all the small block testing that I've done, this series was probably my favorite because I did so many different steps. We ran so many different combinations with this thing. We ran it all the way up to where this thing made some very serious power with the hydraulic roller cam and big heads and an intake manifold and all that stuff. But along the way, we got to test a lot of stuff, including 2-barrel induction systems and headers and stock heads and ported stock heads and a variety of different cams and stuff. So it was very cool. But starting out on this 350 with stock 882 heads, it did have flat top pistons in it. It had a stock 180 or 190 horsepower truck cam in it that we got from a local auto parts store. It had a 2-barrel cast iron intake manifold with a 2-barrel Rochester 2G carburetor. It did have long tube headers on it. and run in this manner, the 350 managed to produce a whopping 247.6 horsepower. And torque wasn't terrible, but 365 foot-pounds of torque. We ran it all the way down to 2,300 RPM, and you can see the torque is fairly constant down in that low RPM range. So a 350-inch motor makes fairly good torque. But here's the first combination that we ran. And the power was up pretty dramatically, 364 horsepower, and more importantly, 422 foot-pounds. As you can see, it was over 400 foot-pounds for quite a ways. And this was a fairly simple combination. It's one of my favorites because it's something that anybody could duplicate. We had a fairly small camshaft in this. It was still a hydraulic camshaft. It was a pure energy 246 cam, so basically top of the page, the smallest aftermarket cam that comp offered for a small block Chevy. So it was very tiny, and I'll go ahead and put the specs up there so that you can see it. But any cam that has a 2.0 something duration camshaft is pretty small. It idles like a stock one. It runs very well, but it makes good power. I've run that camshaft in a back-to-back test against stock cams, and it picks up quite a bit of power despite the fact that it would have been considered an old RV cam, let's say. We also had an RPM intake manifold on here with the dual plane. With a dual plane intake the dual plane intake manifold and the 650 Demon carburetor to go along with. And the other change that we made in addition to the camshaft was we took the 882 heads and had them ported. And that not radical, but mildly ported, port match, did a little bit of bowl work, the kind that you would do if you did it yourself at home. And the combination worked out very well. As you can see, you know, not a huge peak power number, but very good torque and very good average power production. So this combination worked fairly well. We did step up from there with a set of aftermarket heads. In this case, they were Holley 23-degree aluminum heads. We put an Extreme Energy 268 cam in, so a much more modern cam design, a little bit more aggressive. Again, like with the Pure Energy, I'll go ahead and put the specs up here for the comp Extreme Energy that we use. We use an RPM air gap intake manifold, and again with the 650 carburetor. And so equipped, that combination produced 419 horsepower, and torque was up basically everywhere, 444 foot-pounds of torque. And you can see, at least at wide open throttle, this combination worked very well. It made the same torque even down at 2400 or 2500 as the milder combination did. It's just that the extra camshaft and extra breathing from the cylinder heads and a good dual plane intake manifold and the right carburetor all combined to make this combination work very, very well in this RPM range, and it made peak power out at 55 or 5600 and carried all the way out to 6000. So it has a good broad power range, nice little small block. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what do we learn from this little adventure with bolt-on performance parts for our small block Chevy? Well, in typical fashion, every small block responds to bolt-on performance, from the lowly 265 all the way up to the gigantic, relatively speaking, 400-inch small block, and every motor in between, including the much maligned 305, obviously the 350, and the one in the middle, the 327. They all respond to bolt-on performance. If you improve the head flow, the cam timing, and the induction system, good things are going to happen to your small block Chevy. Armature holder, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More and more testing coming up.